presence of THC in a driver's oral fluid, blood or urine. The Honourable Sophia Mormont.
Yes. I read now. I move the motion standing in my name.
Members, the Honourable Sophia Mormont has moved 1. That this House welcomes the Cook Government's commitment to establish a working group to investigate sensible changes to our driving laws which would allow patients prescribed medicinal cannabis to drive if not impaired, and urges the working group to consider the establishment of a complete defence to the presence of THC in a driver's oral fluid, blood or urine in circumstances where A, the driver has a valid doctor's prescription for a medicine containing THC, and B, the offence does not involve dangerous or reckless driving, and C, an officer has not established driver impairment by any other means. 2, this House further calls upon the Government to set a reporting date for the working group such that the legislative changes can be debated ahead of the next election. The Honourable Sophia has moved that motion, and the question is the motion be agreed. The Honourable Sophia Mormont.
Thank you, President. I am pleased to note that the Government has adopted most of the recommendations of the Select Committee report into cannabis and hemp, with 3 of the recommendations supported, 6 recommendations supported in principles, 2 recommendations noted, 1 recommendation partially supported, and 2 recommendations unfortunately not supported. Today, I would like to focus on recommendation number 8, which is the West Australian Government amend the Road Traffic Act 1974 and Road Traffic Drug Driving Regulations 2007 to introduce a defence for patients using medicinal cannabis as prescribed who are not driving whilst impaired or under the influence of alcohol. And the report found that the inclusion of THC as prescribed illicit drug in the Road Traffic Regulations 2007 predates the legalisation of medicinal cannabis, and that current roadside drug testing for THC does not adequately assess the actual or likely risk a driver may pose to others, to themselves or others on the road. Current roadside testing for cannabis sits at 5 micrograms, which is an incredibly sensitive test. This would undoubtedly prove presence, but does not necessarily prove impairment. Other jurisdictions where cannabis or THC is used medicinally and people can get a medical exemption for that, test at 15 to 20 micrograms, all done in a saliva swab. So those tests are less sensitive and might be more useful in deciding impairment separate from the THC medication that they're on. And whilst it should be obvious, no one in any of the legalised cannabis parties in Australia wants impaired drivers to be on the road. We want a system that ensures the safety of everyone, but we also want a system that is fair to those on medicinal cannabis. Currently, those who are medicated are being discriminated against, especially when those who use other medications that may cause impairment are allowed to drive. There are plenty of medications that can cause an altered state, including over-the-counter medications like Phenergan, something that is often forgotten about. But Phenergan can be used as something to induce sleep. It's an hypnotic because it crosses the blood-brain barrier, yet people will happily use that for allergies, in particular for hay fever and things like that. But it can alter their state. The report also found that provision for a medical defence for unimpaired drivers who are detected with prescribed medicinal cannabis in their system is available in Tasmania. And currently before the Parliament in Victoria, providing a point of reference for comparable legislative changes that may be suitable for WA. The WA's government's response to the report included a commitment to establish a medicinal cannabis and safe driving working group to consider reasonable amendments to the Road Traffic Act of 1974 and Road Traffic Regulations 2007, which would allow a medical defence or a defence for patients using medicinal cannabis as prescribed who are not driving whilst impaired, whilst ensuring the safety of all Western Australian road users. The WA government also indicated that the working group should include representatives from WA Police, Department of Transport, the Road Safety Commission, Department of Health and medical practitioners. We have so far suggested 3 suitable candidates, one an adjunct professor for accident research and road safety who has specialised in driver behaviour for the last 20 years, and then 2 other doctors who prescribe cannabis for their patients and who've been doing so for quite some time. Now, recently there's been a worldwide renaissance in the use of cannabis for medical purposes for a range of conditions. So up to 150 conditions have been noted specifically, but we're looking at chronic pain, muscle spasticity in multiple sclerosis, for instance, chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting, palliative care, and severe forms of childhood epilepsy and epilepsy. Now, this mainstreaming of cannabis medicine shows a need for regulatory change, because otherwise we have a system that is discriminatory and it targets specifically people who have difficult to treat medical conditions. A regulatory framework allowing legal access to medicinal cannabis products has operated in Australia since November 2016 through the Special Access Scheme pathway. This enables prescribers to apply to the Therapeutic Good Administration for approval to prescribe a product to an individual suffering from a specific indication. So, according to the Federal Department of Health, between July 2016 and June 2023, a total of 797,218 patients have been prescribed medicinal cannabis in Australia. I have not come across any data that shows an increase in accidents, and I feel it quite safe to state that some of those who've been prescribed medicinal cannabis are driving and are not necessarily increasing or reducing the safety on our roads. However, in all Australian states, if a person is found to have drugs in their system, including cannabis, whilst driving or in charge of a vehicle, they are potentially infringing laws. Now, in most Australian states, it is not significant whether the person was prescribed medicinal cannabis or obtained the cannabis from the black market. It is also not noted whether the person is impaired by the substance or whether the drug has affected their ability in any way to operate a vehicle. So for our purpose here today, though, making the distinction between medicinal users, which is entirely legal, and black market cannabis, which is not legal, is important in ending discrimination. It is useful to note, I feel too, that people are allowed to drive without restrictions on CBD-only cannabis products. So in Tasmania, it is unlawful to drive under the influence of THC unless it is administered in accordance with the Poisons Act 1971. So in this state, a person is not permitted to drive a vehicle to the extent that a person is incapable of having proper control of the vehicle, for example, being impaired. But if there's no impairment, but they test positive to cannabis, THC, they can use that as their defence. Now, the penalties for being caught with drug driving in our state are not insignificant. Under the charge of driving with specific fluids or specific drugs in oral fluid, the first offence is a fine of $1,250 and a loss of 3 demerit points. Second and subsequent offences range from $1,250 to $2,000 and 6-month minimum licence disqualification. So imagine that you are taking cannabis medicine for nausea during your chemo treatment and you're driving to hospital, you get pulled over and you are not impaired, but you're also not nauseous, which is good, yet you end up having your licence taken away from you. Now, this would be a shame because it will make it more difficult to access further treatments in the future. Now, the more serious offence of drug-impaired driving or driving under the influence of drugs applies to drivers found to be so impaired by either prescription or illicit drugs that they are not capable of proper control of a vehicle. Penalties there range from $1,750 to $7,500 and licence disqualification from 10 months to life. And I think that's fair. No one should be behind a steering wheel if they are impaired. And in the event of a car accident, the insurer may invalidate the driver's right to coverage if the driver is charged with driving under the influence of drugs, even if impairment has not been noted. And once again, if you're thinking of your cancer patient who's going to hospital for chemotherapy and is not impaired but is in an accident, that would be quite discriminatory against them. Now, today, the Honourable Brian Walker and myself here are to advocate for those people who have been prescribed medicinal cannabis. They aren't criminals and they should not be penalised as such, with negative effects on their life and capacity to work and take care of their loved ones should not be impeded by their use of medicinal cannabis. We acknowledge the difficulties associated with regulating around this issue, as that both native cannabinoids and metabolites show a long positivity at low concentration in biological fluids, especially in case of regular or chronic consumption. Now, it is known that THC can be found up to 3 months after uses and can be stored in the fat of the body. You can come across it in hair testing as well. And those things have nothing to do with impairment whatsoever. Now, it has also been noted that people can test positive to cannabis, to THC, even if just by being exposed to second-hand smoke. So if you are somewhere at a wild party and you inhale some of that, or just breathing in, like what happened when people used to smoke normal cigarettes, that can also create a positive test and does not indicate in itself that the person was actually using or that they are impaired. Same with that, such low dosages that we are testing for in people at that 5 milligram mark or microgram mark does not show impairment either. Now, you can get obviously very sensitive tests, and the more sensitive a test is, the more expensive it tends to be as well. So for the WA Police to use less sensitive tests that move away from proving presence to going towards an impairment test, would actually reduce the cost of the testing. Now, a recent study which was based on the Australian situation and published in 2021 showed that road safety risks associated with medicinal cannabis appear similar or lower than numerous other potentially impairing prescription medications, and methadone is one of those drugs tested against. The application of presence-based offences to medicinal cannabis patients appears to derive from the historical status of cannabis as a prohibited drug with no legitimate medical application. This approach is now resulting in patient harms, including criminal sanctions when not impaired, and using the drug as directed by their doctor, or the forfeiting of car use and related mobility. Others who need to drive are excluded from accessing needed medication and associated therapeutic benefit. Medical exemptions for medicinal cannabis in comparable jurisdictions and other drugs included in presence offences in Australia demonstrate a feasible alternative approach. The study concluded that in medical-only access models, there is little evidence to justify the differential treatment of medicinal cannabis patients compared with those taking other prescription drugs with potentially impairing effects. Now, I acknowledge that the literature on cannabis use and risks to road safety can suggest a low to moderate increase in crash risk compared to driving sober, and that's a small fraction of total crashes could be avoided by eliminating cannabis-impaired driving. The impact of cannabis-impaired driving is minor, though, relative to that of alcohol-impaired driving. And in those tests being done, it is not distinguished whether people are also on alcohol or other drugs. When they are tested, the presence of THC is noted and is then seen as an issue. But the combination of THC with other substances, including alcohol, isn't specifically being studied here. Now, it has been noted with a study in the Netherlands, and the Netherlands have done quite a few studies here, that people, one of the ways that they measure impairment is in-lane weaving. Now, if you've got a new car, your car will beep when you get too close to the lines in the road, okay? And in-lane weaving is one indicator of impairment. So when they had 4 groups, they had a group of people who got stoned, they had a group of people who got stoned with alcohol, a group who just drank alcohol, and then a group who was sober. And they found that the group who had alcohol and THC in their system displayed the most amount of in-lane weaving. And that started already at 0.02 blood alcohol level. So it was actually the combination of cannabis and alcohol that caused the greatest impairment. So going forward, what I would like to see then is that is acknowledged, and that we, when we have patients on medicinal cannabis, that they are told that they must not drink with that, especially if they use some of the medications earlier in the day. So I thought it was quite interesting to see that the combination of cannabis and alcohol at a blood alcohol level of 0.02 created greater in-lane weaving than 0.05 blood alcohol level. And I don't think that's really in the public consciousness as yet. And that is something that will need to be discussed, and that the public does need to be educated on. So in this motion, we are advocating for medicinal cannabis users who are not impaired, and are requesting that regulation policies regarding the legality of driving by medicinal cannabis patients adopt a focus on the cannabinoids concentration above a defined threshold, or in presence of demonstrated state of cognitive alteration. So we used to have sobriety tests for people before we had the little testers that the police now use for blood alcohol level, the breath tests. And those sobriety tests included things like walking in a straight line, being able to touch your nose, simple tasks that require a certain level of coordination. So moving forward, it may well be, and we're seeing this in other countries as well, where a combination of blood, saliva or urine testing is used with an impairment test. Now, some of these impairment tests are becoming more and more popular. One is called Druid. I have spoken about this before in the chamber, that it's a fairly accurate test to look at, say, task changing, the speed of task changing, listening to instructions or reading instructions, and your balance. So combining that with a test like a saliva test would give a fairly accurate idea of whether someone is impaired or not. And if they are, they should absolutely not be on the road. Now, there are some issues too with blood levels or saliva tests in regards that those people who have greater tolerance, and we have noted this in places like Nimbin, for instance, where there are quite a few hippies, and they have great tolerance. They smoke on a regular basis, but they don't seem to be impaired. Whereas if you are a new patient, you first start using it, you kind of need to figure out what dose is suitable for you, and that may create some more impairment initially, but certainly if you're working with your doctor, you get your dose right, in the end, you should not be impaired on the road. The other thing that we need to look at is making it simple for the police to test on roadside tests. So which would be the easiest way to do that? Is that a blood test? Is that oral fluid? Is that through the breath like we do with alcohol? Or do we need to look at urine testing? Now, obviously, those urine and blood are much more invasive and require more equipment. And for urine, obviously, you need to have some urine in your bladder to be able to test that. The tests need to be quick and relatively cheap. Now, I've just had a university student who chose cannabis testing for impairment. He did a lot of research and he came up with that a combination of testing, impairment testing and presence testing are probably the way forward. In the end, we hope that our motion is seen by the government and that we requested this House calls upon the government to set a reporting date for the working group such that legislative changes can be debated ahead of the next election.
Members, the question is the motion be agreed. The Leader of the House.
Thanks, President. I'd like to thank the honourable member for bringing this motion before the House. As she indicated, on the 30th of March this year, the Select Committee tabled the report, Medicinal Cannabis and Industrial Hemp in Western Australia, and the committee made 16 recommendations, which the government supported 11, partially supported 1, noted 2 and did not support 2. Now, the motion before us is in 2 parts, and so we find ourselves in a difficult position. We'd like to say thank you for welcoming the establishment of the working group, but we find ourselves in a position where we can't support the whole motion because we're not in a position to commit to a finite date to conclude that working group's work, and we can't commit to bringing legislation before the House and for it to be debated before a specified date either. So while we are sympathetic, I guess, to what you're trying to achieve in setting a timeline, we're just not in a position to agree to that, but understand entirely why you would want one. And of course, I'll make some comment on the work that the Minister is doing. So the specific paragraph in the government response, which deals with part 1 of the motion, says that the WA government will establish a working group to consider reasonable amendments to the Road Traffic Act and regulations which would allow for a defence for patients using medicinal cannabis as prescribed who are not driving whilst impaired, while ensuring the safety of all West Australian road users. Further to that, the government has committed to establish a working group that could include membership from Health, WA Police, Road Safety, the Department of Transport and medical experts. And the Minister notes, as the honourable member raised, the Honourable Brian Walker sent a list of recommended medical experts to the government, which has been provided to the Minister for Health, and we thank him for doing that. So we could support part 1 of the motion, but it's part 2 that causes us some difficulty, which effectively calls for a bill to be put before the House and debated by a finite date. And given we're so early in only establishing the working group, we're just not in a position to agree to that. I can advise the House, though, that the Department of Health has commenced the process of establishing the Medicinal Cannabis and Safe Driving Working Group. The membership has not yet been finalised, and there will be some internal administrative arrangements that need to be made so that the working group can set itself up and start doing the work that it needs to do. The Minister for Health will give consideration in due course as to when she asks the working group to report back to her, but until that occurs, we're just not in a position to support the motion before us because of that second part. I can, though, update the House on the 11 other recommendations made by the Select Committee that we supported either in full or in principle. And considerable work is already in progress to implement those recommendations. So the government supported the recommendation relating to making prescription of medicinal cannabis less restrictive for medical practitioners, including reducing the administrative burden and improving health consumer access. That work is underway, and much of that work relates to the current requirements of the Medicines and Poisons Regulations of 2017. Comprehensive consultation has now been completed over the regulatory amendments that would remove the need for prescribers to always gain authorisation from the department, allow interstate doctors to prescribe and relax maximum treatment dose limits. The resulting impact statement from this consultation has now been published by the Department of Health online, and if I may, I'll table a hard copy of that, President.
That document is tabled.
Activities around drafting the activities for these amendments have commenced, and the updated regulations are anticipated for delivery in 2024. Those changes will work alongside the Script Check WA real-time prescription monitoring system that was successfully implemented by the Department of Health earlier this year. The department has also commenced targeted discussions with specialist health practitioner groups on detailed aspects of the Schedule 8 prescribing code, which will support the regulatory amendments. Following delivery of the updated regulations, the department intends to commence work on updating and enhancing medicinal cannabis advisory materials for health professions and health consumers. Work on assessing the feasibility of a medicinal cannabis advisory service is currently in planning stages. Again, I'd like to thank the Chair, the members of the Select Committee and the member today for bringing the motion before the House. The Minister does advise me that we do intend to implement the changes we've agreed to already within a reasonable time frame, and work is well underway on many of those recommendations.
Members, the question is the motion be agreed. The Honourable Brian Walker.
Thank you, President. And thank you also to Leader of the House. I was delighted to hear that contribution and so thankful that action is being taken. I have to criticise you on one point here. Now I've got to rewrite my entire speech I was going to give. So I'll have to do this on the fly, because I wanted really to acknowledge that all of us in this House generally would agree with the principle of this motion, all of us. And I'd like to consider that all of us would certainly agree with the fact, share our point of view, that no one should be driving while impaired. Absolutely no one. As a practising GP, if I'm writing a recommendation for someone's licence to be retained, if I have the opinion, I've done all the tests, but my gut feeling is, if my wife and children were driving in the other direction, would I be happy this man was on the road? And I said, no, I would be saying, I'll have to reconsider this and send you on for special testing, because it is paramount that if my wife and children need to be kept safe, so does every single member of this state and nation. Driving while impaired for whatever reason is simply unacceptable. So we in the Legalise Cannabis Party of WA welcome the commitment the government has made, therefore, to creating this working group. And we thank you very much for having listened to the Select Committee. I must actually congratulate all the members of that committee for doing a sterling job. I really do appreciate that. But the last point here, and I agree very much with the Leader of the House saying that the last point here, the calls upon the government to set a reporting date for the working group, such that legislative changes can be debated ahead of the next election. I would like very much to put some personal faces to this, because, you see, this is talking about people in all of our communities. Each one of us in this room, each one of us will have people in our respective electorates who will embody one or other of these examples I'm going to give. Names are altered, but the facts are there. You see, I'm a practising doctor. So Adam contacted my office about 6 months ago. Cancer treatment, toxic cancer treatment, with debilitating nausea, debilitating, none of the medication that we prescribe, even on Dancitron, would not work. Cannabis, however, did provide him with relief from that debilitating nausea. What then happened, of course, is you got tested by the police, a random drug test, tested for THC, and now this business owner is faced with losing his licence and therefore losing his business. Or he could refuse to use the life-saving medication, cannabis, and suffer the debilitating effects of the treatment. And that would then leave him unfit for work. And then his employees would therefore lose their job because the business would collapse. Can you imagine that you're going to lose your business, your livelihood, because you've tested positive for a drug which I have prescribed? That means you're going to have to deny yourself treatment and suffer quite horribly because you don't want to either let yourself down or let your employees down. It's unacceptable. When I spoke to him, he was distraught. Losing the licence, perhaps, would cost him his business. But how about his family? He's having a life-saving treatment with horrible side effects. They're facing the loss of their husband, their father, okay? And then, on top of that, losing their livelihood, maybe losing their accommodation. All because we think that this person, although he was found to have THC, not one single speck of evidence suggested he was driving while impaired. So a perfectly normal, law-abiding, unimpaired citizen is facing catastrophic loss because of a law that we have created, an unscientific law, an inaccurate law, a lie of a law. And this is unacceptable. We can't tolerate this even for 1 second, to have a lie enshrined in law. Carol, a teacher, suffered back pain. She bending over small children, an accident at school. The list of drugs. Let me list these drugs that she's taking just to get through the day right now. Tapentadol, which is a synthetic opioid, 200 milligrams twice a day, 50 milligrams of tapentadol as needed, the quick-release form. Amitriptyline, a fairly major antidepressant, but also useful for pain, but makes you sleepy, 10 milligrams in the morning, 25 at night to help her sleep. And on top of that, oxycodone, an opiate for breakthrough pain. Now, you're taking all of these drugs and you're teaching children. You're going to be impaired by your teaching, let alone driving. None of these drugs came with a ban on driving. The obligation is, if you're required, is that you should not drive if you feel that you are impaired. So the onus is on you. If you don't think you can drive, don't drive. There's no ban. It's up to you to decide. Now, the well-known side effects of these as drowsiness, reduced cognitive ability, blurred vision, confusion, loss of concentration. And I can assure you all, from my personal clinical experience, my direct observations, that is individually correct. Not only individually, but can you imagine putting these drugs together, the cumulative effect of those drugs on your cognition? The effect is much worse. And yet, the opiates that she is now taking are habituating, they're addictive, potentially fatal, even when taken alone. How much more when taken in combination, especially with alcohol and benzodiazepines. And yet, such patients are permitted to drive and do not get tested either for impairment or for presence. So what's the medical or the legal reason for such discrimination? I mention the word discrimination against a medicine such as cannabis, which is both proven to be effective and also, be it clearly said, much safer. Now, no one here argues for the right to drive when impaired. No one. Yet it appears that the law currently permits people to drive when impaired. Let me say that again. The law, as it stands today, currently allows people who are impaired to continue driving. Now, we in the Legalise Cannabis Party WA do not support this at all. We support that no one should be driving while impaired. We do support the recognising that driving with THC in measurable quantities is not correlated with evidence of impairment. So we advocate not for a test of presence, but for an accurate measure of impairment. An accurate measure of impairment which can test for the effects of driving impaired while sleep deprived. When your mood is altered for whatever reason, the stress, the anxiety you might have, these impairments are measurable and they have an effect on our driving ability. How many accidents, fatal accidents, are occurring because people are driving while impaired due to other substances or other situations? And we would like the police to be in the possession of adequate testing for impairment to keep our roads safe, to keep my wife and children safe, if I want to be very personal, as all of us here would agree. Now, she came to me asking if medicinal cannabis might be a workable alternative for the basket load of highly addictive opioids. And it might. The Neuroscience Institute in Seattle has done a lot of promising work in this area in recent years, concluding that cannabis has been shown to be effective to treat back pain with an acceptable side effect profile. The medication she's taking now, she'd be much safer using cannabis, much more cognitively aware, able to teach her students better, able to drive better, able to function better in her daily life. But Carol's a teacher and needs a car to get to her work, and she must not lose her licence. In other words, because of the laws that we have created and that we currently support, she has to make the choice of having worse health, suffering, or driving illegally. Now, I'm permitted to prescribe that medication for her, but she's not permitted to drive with it in her system. It's a situation I regularly see in my clinic. Every day I'm prescribing, I see this. And colleagues, this cannot be allowed to continue. And so the last point here, that we're calling for a reporting date, I appreciate the words of the Leader of the House, very correct. She's unable to guarantee, to put a firm date down. What I'm asking for is to give a prick of urgency, that this is not to be left to linger while other, perhaps more important things are being done. Because people right now are suffering. They're suffering acutely. Their health is suffering because we are not taking the urgent action we need. And I'm hoping that you might agree, that this House might agree, that we should take note and work very hard to speed up the process. Because in my electorate, among my patients, and I'm sure among all of your electorate and all of the people who are in your areas, this is going to be a story repeated again and again and again. We'll take David. He was in a car accident, but he was not at fault. Someone actually caused the accident. However, all involved were given roadside tests, including for alcohol, and he tested positive for THC. He is taking cannabis to manage his post-traumatic stress disorder, a debilitating mental illness. And with his cannabis, he's able to function as a normal human being. So when he got to court, he found he hadn't been charged with driving while impaired by drugs. That's section 64AB of the Road Traffic Act 1974. No. He was charged under section 64AC, subsection 1, which makes it illegal to drive with a prescribed illicit substance in your system. That's whether you're impaired or not. This is actually very interesting, because it appears that the WAPOL clearly knows that the mere presence does not imply impairment. It would appear that legislators also knew that full well, because they included this catch-all clause. They were therefore aware, as were the lawmakers, that's us, who signed off on these clauses, that there are many instances where impairment is simply not present. The fallback for police is therefore the discriminatory, the scientifically debunked fear of cannabis itself. The fallback is an argument that presence alone of THC is equivalent to impairment. That fault-ridden, inaccurate, unscientific law states that the THC presence equates with impairment and therefore the police are obliged to obey against their better judgment. David asked WAPOL for advice in the run-up to his trial, and they told him he should buy his own oral drug testing kits. The 5 micrograms you heard about? Very, very sensitive, and tests people who absolutely are not impaired. But even then, he couldn't get his hands on an oral drug testing kit, only the urine kits, which is what you use, of course, when you're going on site. And that is the one which measures 6 to 12 weeks later, you've still tested positive for cannabis. How ridiculous is that? We'll talk about the FIFO issues with being unable to work with cannabis in your system. Anyway, that perfectly correct advice from the police was completely wrong, unsuitable. His own GP gave other advice. His own GP, the expert in this, said, you should be fine after 4 hours. You should be quite fine and unimpaired after 4 hours. He, being very safe and very conservative, waited 8 hours before driving. A very safe window. Most conservative estimates put that out there as being safe, scientific, and medically proven. Now, the lack of scientific rigour, the lack of evidence, the lack of a verifiable measure of impairment has resulted in this lie being crafted to sit on the statute books. So David was caught in the application of a faulty law. It's a well-meaning law. It's designed to help reduce the carnage on our roads, but it is inadequate for the purpose. And if we take no action now, if we delay action, we are responsible for continuing a process of manifest injustice. We should not. We should not. David stuck to his guns. He pleaded not guilty on the grounds that he was adhering to the advice he received from his doctor. There was a lot of to and fro. His mental health suffered. He was anguished because this unjust law was being applied. He could lose his insurance support. That would cost him money. He didn't have any money. He was living barely on survivable levels just now. There was this fair bit of back and forth, as I said, between his lawyer and the WAPOL, and then the police decided, sensibly, to drop the charge and issued him with a simple warning. That's good common sense. That's good policing, actually. But does that mean the law is working as it was intended? I don't think you can argue that, when we clearly have an issue with this section 64 AC subsection 1. So, clearly, there's much for the planned working group to do. We need to serve the people of the state. We need to ensure that the laws that we pass are both correct and serve the people as we intend. This is our job. This is our duty. If we don't do that, we have failed in our duty. And we currently have a law on our statute books which is neither true nor does it serve the people. And in fact, as in Adam's experience, and Carol and David, we have got damage to the physical health, to mental health, to the social health, and indeed to the financial health of current law-abiding citizens who are using a prescribed drug properly. And so far, we are happy with that. Because if we were not happy with it, we'd make the changes urgently, we'd make them now. We wouldn't hang around. We'd want to do something this very moment. So I've established that the foundations of wellness, as we measure them in physical, mental, social and financial, are being harmed by adhering to a law which is outdated, which is past its sell-by date, which doesn't serve the people and which is actually factually a lie. I could call it incorrect, but it's a lie. So I'd be asking, please, while I appreciate this House is not going to support this excellent motion of my colleague, I appreciate that, and I appreciate the reasons that the House will not support this motion. Could I, in the back chambers, behind the chair, could I, amongst ourselves, could I encourage all of us to put pressure on the system, to put pressure on the people who actually have the whip hand in this, to actually move forward with more urgency than currently is being perceived? I must say, I thank the government for having listened to the Select Committee. I thank the government for the work they have already begun. This is magnificent. It's beautiful to hear. I was delighted to hear that. But we must have a little bit more urgency because people right now are suffering. Your constituents right now are suffering. And this cannot be tolerated. We have the power to change this. Adam, Carol and David and thousands of others are waiting on us to do this. Societal peace and safety is ultimately in our hands, is it not? The well-being of the community is in our hands. And we must stand up to the challenge and take urgent action now. I would ask you, seriously, after this is over, in our private time, having a cup of coffee, having some tea, eating with our colleagues across the chamber, let us urge each other to take more urgent action because this is needed. So I thank the government for their agreement to create this working group. Let us please set an urgent time frame and rectify at least this small aspect of legislation.
Members, the question is the motion be agreed. The Honourable Lorna Harper.
Thank you, President. As a person who was part of the Select Committee into Cannabis and Hemp, I thought it would be appropriate to go up and say a few words. I will let you know that I will not be either supporting your motion. As usual, following the Honourable Brian Walker and there's so many words, is enthusiasm of what the benefits of medicinal cannabis are, where it can be seen all the way through the committee. But one of the undeniable facts was that nowhere we went did anybody have the answer for driving with medicinal cannabis in their system. It is a very complex issue that needs time and a lot of consideration before we come up with a solution. Yes, the government has agreed to the recommendation. There is a working group and they are working towards that. We need to give them the time and the time to consider this because, as you said, it is a safety aspect. It is a safety issue. And when you open one little can of worms about medicinal cannabis, believe me, about 50 other things pop up. There is an issue. Now, this committee is looking at medicinal cannabis and about driving with impairment. The Honourable Dr Walker talks a lot about driving with opioids, etc., etc. I understand he feels the link. However, it is a completely different subject. It is not what this committee is going to look at. We need to be very careful moving forward that while looking at driving and impairment and medicinal cannabis, we do not open up the possibility of anything else. So, yes, the government's already agreed. The government's already got a committee up and working. We're already moving forward. We got a lot of recommendations were agreed to when we came forward with the report. But there is no easy answer. There's no quick answer. We need to take our time. We need to be considerate. And whether it's 2024 or 2025, we need to take that time to ensure that whatever we come up with, that the professionals, that is the medical professionals, the police force, the judiciary, I nearly said it, etc. And it is all going to come together and we're going to come up with a working law. Yes, does it suck for these people? Yes, it does. It's upsetting. However, until that time, it is still illegal to drive with THC in your system. That is the current law. The government has agreed that it needs to be looked at, but again, this is not going to be quick. So whilst you've raised this again, and I'm sure this will be raised again and again and again and again, we have to just take our time and make sure we do it right. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
President.
The question is the motion to be agreed. The Honourable Martin Aldridge.
Thank you, President. And I'd like to thank the Honourable Sophia Momond for bringing the motion to the House, and obviously the Select Committee who initially brought this matter, amongst many others, to the attention of the House in March of this year. I think the exchange so far has been very useful, and certainly the Select Committee report, but also the conversation today has certainly brought this issue to the fore in my mind, and I think there have been some compelling arguments made. I think it is fair to say that as jurisdictions normalise the medicinal use of cannabis, that there will be issues like this that arise, and effectively the regulatory arrangements in Western Australia and indeed other jurisdictions are such that if you are going to seek a prescription and take a drug which has THC in it, in effect you have to give up your ability to drive, because it is unlawful, as the Honourable Lorna Harper has illustrated quite well to the House just now. And it's not just drive a motor vehicle, President. The Road Traffic Act applies to e-ridables, motorised mobility scooters, motorised wheelchairs, motorcycles, quad bikes, tractors and agricultural vehicles. What's not listed is bicycles, and my understanding is the Road Traffic Act also applies to bicycles, but it's not listed, so I'm not exactly clear as to horses. Oh, well, the Honourable Dan Caddy has also raised the issue of horses and indeed any other animals that you might like to ride on a road. Okay. But on that point, it also is not just applicable to roads; it's also applicable the Road Traffic Act, that is to paths, tracks, car parks, and any other place that the public can access. So the application of the Road Traffic Act is quite broad, and it shouldn't be interpreted to just being driving a motor vehicle on public roads. Now, so this issue is something. I mean, we usually the beneficiary as the wait-a-while state of learning how every other jurisdiction within Australia and indeed internationally has addressed this issue, and then we generally cherry pick the best response and implement it. But it is obvious, looking at both the Select Committee's report, but also the contributions today, including the one just now by the Honourable Lorna Harper, but this is an emerging space that we are not the only ones that are seeking to address, and I'll speak about that a little bit further in my contribution this morning, or this afternoon rather. Cannabis-based medicinal products, as you would be aware, have been lawful within Australian jurisdictions, including Western Australia, since 2016, following changes to various state and Commonwealth regulatory frameworks. According to the TGA, since 2017, there have been 22,000 prescriptions for medicinal cannabis in WA and more than 423,000 Australia-wide. Prescriptions in Western Australia amounted to 6,600 in 2021, 6,000 in 2022, and in 2023 to date, 3,400. Now, this needs to be put into some context, and that is, according to the PBS, in 2021, around 14 million prescriptions were dispensed for opioids in Australia and approximately 5.2 million for benzodiazepines. And that goes to the point that I think the Honourable Brian Walker was making, which is the medical defence that exists in the Road Traffic Act with respect to other prescribed medicines. Now, the Select Committee into Cannabis and Hemp, as I stated, released its report in March, which outlined a number of barriers, and one of these was obviously driving laws, which is the issue of that's in focus in today's motion. Division 2 of the RTA deals with alcohol and drug-related offences while driving a vehicle, and Section 64 A B, driving while impaired by drugs, states in subsection 1, a person who drives or attempts to drive a motor vehicle while impaired by drugs commits an offence, and the offender may be arrested without warrant. Subsection 5 says the accused may be convicted of an offence against this section if the prosecutor proves that A, the accused drove or attempted to drive a motor vehicle, and B, one or more drugs were present in the accused's body at the time of that driving or attempted driving. C, the conduct, condition or appearance of the accused at or after the time of that driving or attempted driving or during a driver assessment was consistent with conduct, a condition or an appearance associated with a person who has consumed or used that drug or those drugs, and D, the conduct or condition associated with a person who has consumed or used that drug or those drugs would be inconsistent with the person being capable of having proper control of a motor vehicle. It's also important to note, President, in subsection 8, which states, in any proceeding for an offence against this section, it is a defence for the accused to prove in respect to the drug or each drug referred to in subsection 5, A, the drug was 1, taken pursuant to a prescription of a medical practitioner, nurse practitioner or dentist, and 2, administered by a medical practitioner, nurse practitioner or dentist for therapeutic purposes. So, the Road Traffic Act does establish an offence for driving while impaired by a drug and a defence for driving if that drug is prescribed by a medical practitioner. The RTA also defines a prescribed illicit drug, means a drug that is declared by the regulations to be a prescribed illicit drug. Now, the Road Traffic Drug Driving Regulations 2007, which I note were established some 10 years before medicinal cannabis was legally available, prescribed just 3 drugs: THC, methamphetamine and MDMA. Now, Section 64A, C, refers to driving with a prescribed illicit drug in oral fluid or blood, and it states, 1, a person who drives or attempts to drive a motor vehicle while a prescribed illicit drug is present in the person's oral fluid or blood commits an offence. There does not appear to be a defence for Section 64 AC. This is in contrast to 64AB, which defines the person must be impaired by the drug and presents a defence for those holding a prescription. Now, the first point that I want to make at this point, Acting President, is only 3 illicit drugs are listed in the regulations, which does beg the question how other illicit drugs would be dealt with under the Road Traffic Act. But that is an issue that is separate to the motion that is before us. The Select Committee concluded that WA's RTA, the Road Traffic Act, it is unlawful for anybody to drive with any THC in their system, regardless of whether it's legally prescribed or whether the person is actually impaired. These barriers are summarised in findings 13 to 16 and recommendation 8 of the report. Now, recommendation 8 has been well canvassed, and I'm not going to repeat it, but I think for the purposes of this motion, the first limb, from my perspective, is relatively uncontroversial. The committee made a recommendation. My read of the response from the government, although it says the recommendation is noted, I think that it's probably more than noted, because the government has then gone on to say that they'll establish a medicinal cannabis and safe driving working group, that's quite a mouthful, of relevant experts, both road safety and medical. And so obviously this group hasn't yet been formed, and the government only handed down its response to the report in August of this year. And I think this might have been one of the reports that was delayed the government's response was delayed quite significantly from it being presented back in March to a government response being available in August. But I might be mistaken, it might be another report. But I think this was the one where there were a number of advices to the House with respect to delayed response. Now, it has only been responded to since late August, effectively early September. So the clock is ticking, and I would have thought it would be a priority to establish this working group as quickly as possible, and at least before year's end, so we can start to scope the necessary work that is required in order to provide advice to government as to how to address this issue. The recommendation in the committee's report, I think, aligns with the motion that is before us. And as I said, I don't think I've heard anyone dispute the fact that there does need to be some legislative and regulatory change in this respect. I think where there is dispute is how quickly that should be done, or indeed how quickly it could be done. And I think the Honourable Brian Walker set out some very compelling personal examples, which I think help us personalise this issue, because not everybody may necessarily have that personal experience in terms of the impact of somebody who is relying on medicinal cannabis as part of their treatment for whatever condition they may have, and their ability to drive. And I think on that point, Acting President, removing somebody's ability to drive even whilst unimpaired presents even more significant challenges in regional remote contexts where you may not have the family networks, the support networks. Indeed, you most likely don't have any public transport. You might have some regular air transport, but certainly air transport that you may not necessarily be able to rely upon. So there are added issues with respect to somebody simply giving up their ability to drive, whether that be a motorised wheelchair or whether that be a motor vehicle or indeed some other form of transport, and then perhaps in metropolitan contexts where there are other options available. There is a lot of good information available in the report, and a number of tables, which do, Table 4 in particular, sets out how we are dealing with, for example, opioids, for example, codeine, fentanyl, methadone, morphine, oxycodone and tramadol, sedatives, for example, diazepam, lorazepam and oxazepam, and stimulants such as dexamphetamines and methylphenidate, and over-the-counter medications such as antihistamines, Sudafed cold and flu tablets, drugs which I think the Honourable Sophia Mormont in particular focused on in the course of her contribution, which, if taken, are legal to drive provided that there is an impairment from your ability to drive, in contrast to medicinal cannabis containing THC where it is not legal to do so. The other table, which is the one which follows, is Table 5, and this is where there is some jurisdictional comparison to approaches around the world, and as I said, and the Honourable Lorna Harper before me, that this is a fairly emerging area that is occurring in terms of how we might address this issue. Coming into this debate, I thought that there might be a simple approach, which is simply dealing with prescribed medicinal cannabis in a similar way to other drugs. But I think some of the contribution that the Honourable Sophia Mormont made with respect to a study, and I'm sorry I didn't write down the name of the study, but where the Honourable Sophia Mormont was relating the outcome of this study, where actually the greatest impairment of drivers was those that were under the influence of THC and a low-level BAC, blood alcohol, content rating. So I think that goes to the complexity of the issue that needs to be addressed. And I think the other important point that the Honourable Sophia Mormont made was with respect to what is the actual impairment test that is used, and making sure that it is simple, because obviously we are a large state, we are a large jurisdiction, we have a large road network, so making sure that it is practicable to provide these tests in whatever form they may be across a state and a jurisdiction like ours is an important factor to consider. It's interesting to note in Victoria, they've established a working group, and I'm not sure to what extent that will be similar to the working group once established in Western Australia, and I guess we will all be looking for detail from the government around what that would look like, its terms of reference, its reporting date, which is clearly the contentious part of this motion. But the Victorian government has set up a working group to examine this issue following a private member's bill that was advanced by the Legalise Cannabis Party in Victoria, and that is the Road Safety Amendment Medicinal Cannabis Bill. Now, in Victoria, both the Labor government and the coalition opposition have spoken in support of changing the driving laws for medicinal cannabis users in that state, and the government has since announced, just in August, that it would begin an 18-month trial of medicinal cannabis users on a closed test track. Now, I don't know if that was, I suspect that wasn't the study that the Honourable Sophia Mormont was referring to, because that was fairly, it's only just kicked off in August. But I think the point that critics are making of this approach in Victoria is that are we treating medicinal cannabis in a different way to other pharmaceuticals and other prescription medicines, and is there justification for doing so? I accept that there is complexity to this matter, and I think it is paramount in considering this issue. The issue of public safety and road safety are probably going to be have primacy over other factors. And I think that is something that we can all agree on. I think the Select Committee agreed on, WA Police agree on. I think we have universal agreement on that issue. Now, it obviously is important to also recognise the experience of people who seek a prescription and gain a prescription for medicinal cannabis, and the impact that that has on their ability to lawfully drive in Western Australia, even when their driving it cannot be demonstrated that they're driving whilst impaired by the drug, and that goes to some of the complex issue, particularly around testing. And I think the Honourable Brian Walker made the point, as did the Select Committee, that whilst the impairment period can be quite limited. I think there's a range of 5 to 7 hours that I read in the report, 7 hours being for a higher dose, but yet it can be for days and weeks following that you can return a positive test result, and obviously whilst not impaired by the drug. Now, the other thing that might be important to recognise at this point is that in Western Australia we have a significant road safety problem, and I think that is why everyone involved in this debate, either today or in the lead up to the committee reports, recommendations, or even before that, brings that public safety element first and foremost as one of the primary issues that we have. We have lost, and we are trending for one of our most challenging road serious injury and fatality rates this year than we have seen in the last decade, and many of those involve alcohol and other drugs. And while some of this data is a little old, the Road Safety Commission released a report in 2016 which showed 1 in 5 people killed on WA roads were involved in an alcohol-related crash, and 3/4 of these occur in regional Western Australia, despite just 20% of the population living in our regions. He went on to say that the numbers of reported drug use prior to driving is low, but it is on the increase. Now, that data is a few years old, but it is important to keep in mind in the context of this debate. In that report, it also found that cannabis is the most used illicit drug in Australia and the second most common drug type identified in toxicology for road crash fatalities in that year being 2016. So there are a number of issues that need to be weighed up. I mean, obviously the Road Safety Commission was talking generally about the issue of drug use and driving. This motion is talking about the issue of driving whilst having a valid and legal prescription for medicinal cannabis. So there are distinctions to be made, but I agree with the arguments around the need to make sure, and there'll be attention here, and the need to make sure that we respond appropriately and particularly with thought in mind for those people that the Honourable Brian Walker described, but making sure that we do it to an extent that ensures that we preserve public and community safety on our roads.
The question is that the motion be agreed. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Acting President. Acting President, I must admit that I've come to the Legalise Cannabis discussion a bit late, and I come with a very conservative view generally, that I haven't been. Yes, I know it's a surprise to members opposite. You might find me on the right wing of the opposition, but no, I'm trying to be. It's not a Thursday yet, member. It's only a Wednesday, so settle down. It's only a Wednesday. Now, so I mean, but I thought this was a really interesting motion by the Honourable Sophia Mamond in that it actually isn't calling for a specific change apart from the investigation, and for the investigation to be set with a reporting date that might deliver an outcome. Now, the outcome might be that a committee looks at this and says we remain concerned about the impact of THC on drivers, and we couldn't, in good conscience, recommend that it be allowable under the circumstances proposed by the Legalise Cannabis Group, which is, I have to say, something that I have experienced. So I have had constituents who have been prescribed cannabis, so in a legal sense, and in fact I have an in-law family member, so which might be actually a step down from a constituent. Let's be a bit cautious there. Who is in that exact position where they have prescribed cannabis for very long-term back pain and following a mining industry many decades ago, and then also runs the same risk that I'm sure constituents of both the Honourable Sophia Mamond and Dr. Brian Walker have experienced, and that's the reason that they've brought the motion before the House today. So whilst not necessarily 100% behind their cause, I thought that their motion was very good in that it simply calls for the investigation to be done in a timely manner. And in fact, This may be, Acting President, the only time in my parliamentary career that I support, to some degree, the intent of someone who moves a welcoming of a government activity. I suspect it's not very common that I'll actually do that. It is, though, simply that in part one of the motion that the mover would welcome the Cook Government's commitment to establish the working group. Now, it urges the working group to consider the establishment of a defence. It doesn't say a defence must be established. It says that it should be examined. And I thought that was relatively reasonable. And as the Leader of the House in presenting the government's response said, there were many parts of this motion to which the government agreed, in particular because the government has established a working group. Now, I think the issue with which the government has is in part two, that this House further calls on the government to set a reporting date for the working group such that the legislative changes can be debated ahead of the next election. Now, I thought that the Honourable Martin Aldridge gave an excellent overview of activity that's happened across various states, and he made reference of the Victorian research that's being done. Now, that is going to take well more than a year. And so the response to that and the information gleaned from that will presumably form a part of Victoria's response to this particular issue, and that's going to take a period of time that's longer than the one, I think, set by the motion before the House. And it is certainly the case, as I understood the response from the Leader of the House, that was the part of this debate with which the government had the most problem. That is, that it is in fact examining these issues. It has a working group that it is committed to. I don't think that it's established a working group as yet. It's simply committed to putting one in place, and perhaps the motion might have suggested a time frame by which the group was established, as opposed to reporting. So we might have jumped ahead a little bit because I might have. So I think perhaps we might have looked at, and you might give some thought to, as the debate unfolds in what's left of it, the possibility of establishing a commencement date, an establishment date, rather than a reporting date. Because I do understand the issues of the government, and like as I say, I started this saying I'm not an avid supporter of the use of cannabis, but I accept that I might be something of a dinosaur in some of my views. But this is really, so this is less about, in my view, I'm not going to conduct a pharmacological debate here, although I think Honourable Brian Walker, you and I are probably the only people qualified to do so. I'm actually thinking that this is a political question about due process within the House and due process with government. So I thought that the mover of the motion and the Legalise Cannabis Party might look to set a establishment date and an operational date rather than set a reporting date. Now, so one of the options to us is to amend it to set an establishing date. What I thought I might do instead of that, though, and the amendment that I had a quick look at and considered, and may well find myself moving in a few minutes, is to remove the time frame a little. So it could still be a reporting date. So I would propose that in part two of the motion before the House, because I think there's a generalised agreement on part one, if we got rid of all of the words in that final line, those words, such that legislative changes can be debated ahead of the next election, we would remove that urgent time frame. Now, the issue that I see with having legislation debated before the next election is you're competing with the government's legislative agenda. If it was, assuming it would be government legislation, I mean, it doesn't help if it's legalised cannabis legislation because next year you'll get two opportunities for a couple of hours to debate it. So that's not going to proceed a sconce in any way, shape or form. The problem is that the government's got, while the government has this massive one-sided parliament, it is going to try and push through all of the legislation it thinks is to its advantage as a priority over legislation like this. And we've effectively got a year of legislation left. I mean, the final year's sitting schedule was out today. There's a few weeks left this year. There's 19 weeks next year. And 83 bills? Okay. So there's plenty of work to be done already. So I would have thought that the government might, even if it wanted to progress this to the point where their legislation drafters had got to the point of drafting legislation. So by the time you do it's on the committee reports, and then you come back and now you have legislation in the process of being drafted, and it's drafted, and it's then suddenly in debate, and particularly to get to by the time the lower house is usually pretty quick with legislation, but even that last little couple of hours, and then you get to the point where you've got legislation debated before the Parliament. I think the Leader of the House is right. It's probably unrealistic because it doesn't reflect all of the other legislation that the government is going to try and want to do after the research that's done. And if Victoria is spending 12 or 18 months researching a trial, for example, they're not going to be in a position to make recommendations till after that, and they're not going to be in a position after that to give drafting instructions. So I don't think with any will in the world, with the best will in the world, if the government was entirely behind your position, and I'm not sure that it is. I mean, I think you welcome the potential that they're open to it, which is a good constructive conversation. So, you know, it's a Wednesday, not a Thursday. We're all here to help. So, you know, it is possible the government ultimately comes down on your side in this argument, but I don't think there is any possibility that it could do so on the time frame, which is quite formal and strict, set in the motion that you've put before the House. And that's the message that I took from the Leader of the House in her contribution today. So what I'm proposing is that you would simply remove the time frame and ask the government to set a date sometime in the future, and they could give that could be indicative rather than strictly set. So if you set a reporting date. Now, lots of the times we ask government when's something coming, and they say, oh, roughly, you know, March next year or mid-2027 or whatever it is. At least you get an indication that that you can hold the government to account to. And you know, I suspect, even with the changes the government put in place, where they've shattered regional representation in the Legislative Council with this new statewide Senate model, I suspect there's a fair chance that there'll be some representation from the Legalise Cannabis Party after that. So you might find yourselves in a position that there is somebody here to hold the government to account after the next election, because I don't think you have any chance of doing it before the next election. I have some sympathy for the government's argument there, but I have some sympathy for your argument that it should be looked at, and the government should not be able to have simply an open-ended version of this where they could effectively say, well, we're not interested. So purely acting presidents, in an effort to be constructive and assist the House in its deliberations, because that's what the opposition is here to do, I take this opportunity to move the amendment that I have foreshadowed. So, Acting President, I move to amend the motion as follows. In paragraph 2, to delete all words after group.
Leader of the House.
As I indicated when I responded to the motion, there's two parts to the motion. We can live with part one. We can't support it while it includes two. Part two includes two parts, including setting a reporting date and then getting legislation in. And what the amendment that's just been moved does is remove the second part of part two, not the first part. So if somebody wanted to move an amendment, amend the amendment, whatever, to delete part two, we'd be happy to support the motion. But if the only movement is to remove part of part two, then we'll vote against that amendment, because we wouldn't be in a position to support a final motion that had any part of part two in it.
Members, the question is that the words to be deleted. All those of that opinion say aye. Aye. Those to the contrary say no. No. I believe the noes have it. Aye. A division having been called, ring the bells. Is that right? Did I just say that right? Yeah. Did I just say that right? Yeah, a little bit. Yes. Are you doing the count?
Mountain, asparagus. Servicing asparagus, mountain, Mormons. Pellets.
Lock the doors. Members, the question is that the words to be deleted be deleted. Members voting with the ayes shall pass to the right of the chair. Members voting with the noes shall pass to the left of the chair. I appoint the Honourable Peter Foster, teller for the ayes. I'll start that again. I appoint the Honourable Colin de Grusser, teller for the ayes, and appoint the Honourable Peter Foster, teller for the noes. And before the tellers tell, I cast my vote with the noes. Members, the results of the decision are ayes 11, noes 18. The question is resolved in the negative. Members, the question is that the motion be agreed. Give the call to the Honourable Sophia Marmont in reply.
Thank you, Acting President. I would like to thank everyone for their contribution today. I'm surprised and pleased to see the amount of support that we've actually had for this motion, including by the Leader of the House in regards to agreeing with the first part of the motion. It's a shame that we haven't been able to tie the government down to a very specific date on this, but I understand why. And I thank the Honourable Dr. Stephen Thomas for his contribution on the amendment. I think that was very useful. I would just like to touch upon the fact that in Tasmania they do have medicinal cannabis as a driving defence, and the sky hasn't fallen down or anything like that, and there has been no noticeable increase in road safety issues. So they are doing well there with that, and it would be relatively simple to implement something like that here. We wouldn't necessarily have to reinvent the wheel. We could just follow Tasmania. I have to say it's quite surprising that Tasmania is ahead of the rest of Australia in this, and it would be lovely if we could, add WA as wait a while to that as well. Anyway, that's not going to happen, but we hope to, we feel confident that we are moving forward here with our mission here to help make medicinal cannabis more easily available and more fairly available as well. So thank you to all the members who contributed.
Members, the question is that the motion be agreed. All those of that opinion say aye. Those to the contrary say no. I believe the noes have it. A division having been called, ring the bells.
Right at the moment. See who else wants it.
Lock the doors. Members, the question is that the motion be agreed. Members voting with the aye shall pass to the right of the chair. Members voting with the no shall pass to the left of the chair. I appoint the Honourable Brian Walker, teller for the ayes, and the Honourable Peter Foster, teller for the noes. And before the tellers tell, I cast my vote with the noes. Members, the results of the division are ayes 3, noes 29. The question is resolved in the negative.